If I had my life to live over again, I would have made a rule to read some poetry and listen to some music at least once every week. A man who dares to waste 1 hour of time has not discovered the value of life. Ignorance more frequently begets confidence than does knowledge. It is those who know little and not those who know much who so positively assert that this or that problem will never be solved by science. Thus, from the war of nature, from the mean and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, directly follows there is a grandeur in this view of life with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. If the misery of the poor be caused not by the laws of nature but by our institutions, great is our sin. We stop looking for monsters under our bed when we realize that they were inside of us. The love for all living creatures is the most noble attribute of man. It is not the strongest of the species that survives, not the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is the most adaptable to change. I am not apt to follow blindly the lead of the other men. Whilst on board the Beagle, I was quite orthodox, and I remember being heartily laughed at by several of officers for quoting the Bible as an unanswerable authority on some point of morality, wrapping up plus spit and floppity. Intelligence is based on how efficient a species became at doing the things they need to survive. The mystery of the beginning of all things is insoluble by us, and I, for one, must be content to remain an agnostic American monkey for getting drunk in brandy. Would never touch it again, and thus is much wiser than most men. The highest possible stage in normal moral culture is when we recognize that we ought to control our thoughts. Blushing is the most peculiar and most human of all the expressions. Rapping, spitting, freestyling, never ending. There is a grandeur in this point of view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. But I am very portly today and very stupid. I hate everybody, everything, everyone lives only to make blunders, and the long history of humankind and animal kind too. Those who learn to collaborate and improvise most effectively have prevailed. One general law leading to advancement of all organic beings, namely multiply, vary, let the strongest live and the weakest die. But I now own that I cannot see as plainly as others do, and I should wish to do. Evidence of design and beneficence and all sides of us. There seems to me too much misery in the world. I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created with the express intention of their feeding with the living bodies of caterpillars, or that a cat should play with mice. I feel most deeply that the whole subject is too profound. The human intellect of dog might as well speculate on the mind of Newton. Let each man hope and believe what he can. Besides love and sympathy, animals exhibit other qualities connected with the social instincts, which in us would be called moral. A man advances in civilization, and small tribes are united into larger communities. The simplest reason would tell each individual that he ought to extend his social instincts and sympathies to all members of the same nation, although personally unknown to him. This point being once reached, there is only an artificial barrier to prevent his sympathies extended to the men of all nations and races. We must, however, acknowledge, as it seems to me, that man with all his noble qualities still bears in his bodily frame and the indelible stamp of his lowly origin. a man selects only for his own good, nature only for that of the well-being which she tends, with my spent rampant, never ending. If I could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which cannot possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down, but I can't find no such case. We can allow satellites, planets, suns, universe, nay, the whole systems of the universe to be governed by laws of the smallest instinct. We wish to be created at once by special act. The following proposition seems to me in a high degree probable, namely that any animal whatever endowed with well-marked social instincts, the parental and filial affections being here included, would inevitably acquire a moral sense or conscience as soon as its intellectual powers have become as well or nearly as well developed as in man. Perversely, the social instincts lead an animal to take pleasure in the society of its fellows, to feel a certain amount of sympathy with them, and to perform various services for them. Nothing is easier than to admit in words the truth of the universal struggle for life, or more difficult, at least I have found it so, that than constantly to bear this conclusion of mine. I see no good reasons why the views given in this volume shouted shock the religious views of anyone. Great is the power of steady misrepresentation. Man in his arrogance thinks himself a great work, worthy of the interposition of a deity, more humble and I believe truer to consider him created from animals. There is no fundamental difference between man and animals in their ability to feel pleasure and pain, happiness and misery, or the shield may be as important for victory as a sword or spear. Freedom of thought is best promoted by the gradual illumination of men's minds, which follows from the advance of science. To kill an error is as good as service, and sometimes even better than the establishment of a new truth or fact. It is always advisable to perceive clearly our ignorance, to suppose that the eye of all its inimitable contravances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for emitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration could have been formed by natural selection. It seems, I confess, absurd, and the highest degree of the difficulty of believing that a perfect and complex eye could be formed by natural selection, though inseparable by our imagination, should not be considered subversive of the theory. I am not the least afraid to die. Rhymes. We are not half concerned with hopes or fears, only with truth as far as our reason permits us to discover it. But then with me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind, if there are any convictions in such a mind? For my own part, I would as soon be descended from that heroic little monkey who braved his dreaded enemy in order to save the life of his keeper, or from that old baboon who, descending from the mountains, carried away in triumph his young comrade from a crowd of astonished dogs, as from a savage who delights to torture his enemies, offers up bloody sacrifices, practices infanticide without remorse, treats his wives like slaves, knows no decency, and is haunted by the grossest superstitions. False facts are highly injurious to the progress of science, for they often endure long, but false views, if supported by some evidence, do little harm. For everyone takes salutary pleasure in proving their falseness, and when this is done, one path towards error is closed, and the road to truth is often at the same time opened. The very essence of instinct is that it's followed independently of reason, and the loss of these taste for poetry and music is a loss of happiness, and may possibly be injurious to the intellect, and more probably to the moral character, by enfeebling the emotional part of our nature. We are always slow in admitting any great change of which we do not see the intermediate steps We will now discuss in a little more detail the struggle of existence. But we are not here concerned with hopes or fears, only with the truth as far as our reason allows us to discover it. I have given the evidence to the best of my ability, and we must acknowledge, as it seems to me, that man, with all his noble qualities, with sympathy, which feels for the most debased, with benevolence, which extends not only to other men, but to the humblest living creature, with his godlike intellect, which has penetrated into the movements and constitution of the solar system. With all these exalted powers, man still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin. A scientific man ought to have no wishes, no affections, a mere heart of stone. Nevertheless, so profound is our ignorance, and so high our presumption, that we marvel when we hear of the extinction of an organic being, and as we do not see the cause, the rebel devil with our cause, I'm spitting rapping, we invoke cataclysms to desolate the world, or invent laws on the duration of the forms of life. Rhymes all night, wherever the European had trod, death seemed to pursue the aboriginal among the scenes which are deeply impressed on my mind. None exceed in sublimity of a primeval forest, undefaced by the hand of man, or abodes of Brazil, where the powers of life are predominant, or those of Tierra del Fuego, where death and decay prevail. Both are temples filled with the varied productions of the God of nature. No one can stand in these solitudes unmoved and not feel that there is more in man than the mere breath of his body. I steam inside me. The question of whether there exists the creator and ruler of the universe has been answered in the affirmative by some of the highest intellects that have ever existed. We cannot fathom the marvelous complexity. Wrapping up sloppity of an organic being, but on the hypothesis have advanced this complexity. This complexity is much increased. Each living creature must be looked at as a microism, a little universe formed of a host of self-propagating organisms, inconceivably minute and as numerous as the stars in heaven. Origin of man, and now proved metaphysics, must flourish. He who understands baboon would do more towards metaphysics than Locke. In conclusion, it appears that nothing can be more improving to a young naturalist than a journey in distant countries. I feel most deeply that the whole subject is too profound for the human intellect. A dog might as well speculate on the mind of Newton. Let each man hope and believe that he can. Natural selection almost inevitably causes much extinction of the less improved forms of life and induces what I have called divergence of character. I think it inevitably follows that as new species in the course of time are formed through natural selection, others will become rarer and finally extinct. The forms which stand in closest competition with those undergoing modification and improvement will naturally suffer most. But natural selection, as we shall hereafter see, is a power incessantly ready for action and is immeasurably superior to man's feeble efforts, as the works of nature are to those of art. From the start, like a rainbow in the dark, the rhymes begin to start. There are several other sources of enjoyment in a long voyage, which are of a most reasonable nature. The map of the world ceases to be a blanket, becomes a picture full of the most varied and animated figures. Each part assumes in its proper dimensions. Continents are not looked at in the light of islands, or islands considered as mere specks, which are in truth larger than many kingdoms of Europe, Africa, or North and South America are well-sounding names and easily pronounced, but it is not until having sailed for weeks along small portions of their shores that one is thoroughly convinced what vast spaces on our immense world these names imply. Rhymes, but just in proportion as this process of extermination has acted on an enormous scale, so must the number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed by truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory. The explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record. A fair result can be obtained only by fully stating and balancing the facts and arguments on both sides of each question, rapping, spitting, and spatting. I have always maintained that, excepting fools, men do not differ much in intellect, only in zeal and hard work, and I still think there is an eminently important difference. I am dying by inches from not having anybody to talk to about insects, to include, therefore, let no man out of a weak conceit of sobriety or an implied moderation think or maintain that a man can search too far or be too well studied in the book of God's word or in the book of God's works, divinity or philosophy, or rather let men endeavor in endless progress of proficience in both Bacon. Advancement of learning is often attempted to palliate slavery by comparing the state of slaves with our poor countrymen. If the misery of our poor be caused not by the laws of nature, but by our institutions, great is our sin. But how this bears on slavery I cannot see, as well might the use of thumb screw be defended in one land. Wham bam thank you ma'am. I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars. One day on tearing off some old bark, I saw two rare beetles and seized one in each hand. Then I saw a third, a new kind, which I could not bear to lose, so I popped the one which I held in my right hand into my mouth. Alas, and ejected some intensely acrid fluid which burnt my tongue, so that I was forced to spit the beetle out, which was lost, as was the third one. Man, with all his noble qualities, with sympathy which feels for the most debased, with benevolence which extends not only to outer other men, but to the humblest living creature, with his God-like intellect which hath penetrated the movements of and constitution of the solar system. With all these exalted powers, man still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his slowly origin. Only picture to yourself a nice soft life on a sofa with a good fire and books and musics. I could show a fight on natural selection, having done and doing more for the progress of civilization than you seem inclined to admit. Remember what risk the nations of Europe ran not so many centuries ago of being overwhelmed by the Turks, and how ridiculous such an idea now is. The more civilized so-called Caucasian races have beaten the Turkish hollow in the struggle for existence, looking to the world at no very distant day. What an endless number of the lower races will have been eliminated by the higher civilized races throughout the world. It spins and whirls and it twirls, but a plant on the edge of a desert is said to struggle for life against the drought, though more properly it should be said to be dependent upon the moisture. Nothing is easier than to admit in words the truth of the universal struggle for life, or more difficult, at least I have found it so, than constantly to bear this conclusion of mine. We behold the face of nature bright with gladness. We do not see, or we forget, that the birds which are idly seen around us mostly live on insects and seeds, and are thus constantly destroying life. As natural selection acts by competition, it adapts the inhabitants of each country only in relation and to the degree of the perfection of their associates, so that we need feel no surprise at the inhabitants of any one country, although on the ordinary view supposed to have been especially created and adapted for that country, being beaten and supplanted by the naturalized neutralize naturalized productions from the another land. Whilst man, however well behaved, at best is but a monkey shaved rapper behave. If I had my life to live over again, I would make it a rule to read some poetry, listen to music, and see some painting or drawing at least once a week for perhaps the part of my brain now atrophied would then have been kept alive through life. The loss of these tastes is a loss of happiness. It may be worthwhile to illustrate this view of classification by taking a case of languages. If we possessed a perfect pedigree of mankind, a genealogical arrangement of the races of man would afford the best classification of the various languages now spoken throughout the world, and of all extinct languages and all intermediate and slowly changing dialects were to be included. Such an arrangement would be the only possible one, yet it might be that some ancient languages had altered very little and had given rise to few new languages, whilst others had altered much owing to the spread and isolation and state of civilization of several condescended races, and had thus given rise to many new dialects and languages of various degrees of difference between the languages of the same stock. Would have to be expressed by groups subordinate to groups, but the proper or even the most only possible arrangement would still be genealogical, and this would be strictly natural, as it would connect together all languages extinct and recent by the closest affinities, and would give the affiliation and origin of each tongue. I had also during many years followed the golden rule, namely that whenever published fact, a new observation and thought came across me which was opposed to my general results, to make a memorandum of it without fail and at once, for I had found by experience that such facts and thoughts were far more apt to escape from the memory than favorable ones. Spin wrap up bum bum. Our descent then is the origin of our evil passions. The devil under form of baboon is our grandfather. As many more individuals of each species are born than can possibly survive, and as consequently there is frequently reoccurring a struggle for existence. It follows that any being, if it vary however slightly and any manner profitable to itself, under the complex and sometimes varying conditions of life, will have a better chance of surviving and thus be naturally selected from the strong principle of inheritance. Any selective variety will attend to propagate its new and modified form. I have tried lately to read Shakespeare and found it so intolerably dull that it nauseated me. The expression often used by Mr. Herbert Spencer of the survival of the fittest is more accurate and is sometimes equally convenient. Rapid and spit it. A grain in the balance will determine which individual shall live and which shall die, which variety of species shall increase in number, and which shall decrease, or finally become extinct. Often a cold shudder has run through me, and I have asked myself whether I may have not devoted myself to fantasy. In the distant future, I see open fields for far more important researches. Psychology will be based on a new foundation, that of the necessary acquirement of each mental power and a capacity by gradation. A light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. It is difficult to believe in the dreadful but quiet war lurking just below the serene facade of nature. Ignorance more frequently begets confidence than does knowledge. When we no longer look at an organic being as a savage looks at a ship, as at something woefully beyond this comprehension, when we regard every production of nature as one which has had history, when we contemplate every complex structure and instinct as the summing up of many contrivances, each useful to the possessor, nearly in the same way as when we look at any great mechanical invention as the summing up of labor, of experience, the reason, and even the blunders of numerous worksmen. When we thus view each organic being, how far more interesting, I speak from experience, will the study of natural history become. But then arises the doubt, can the mind of man, which has, as I fully believe, been developed from a mind as low as that possessed by the lowest animal, be trusted when it draws such grand conclusions? Englishmen rarely cry, except under the pressure of the acutest grief, whereas in some parts of the continent the men shed tears much more readily and freely. One hand has surely worked throughout the universe. Ignorance more frequently begets confidence than does knowledge. We stop looking for monsters under our bed when we realize they're inside of us. What wretched doings come from the ardor of fame. The love of truth alone would never make one man attack, never bitterly. I have stated that in the 13 species of ground finches, a nearly perfect gradation may be traced from a beak extraordinarily thick to one so fine that it may be compared to that of a warbler. The earthquake, however, must be a warbler. The earthquake, however, must be to everyone a most impressive event. The earth, considered from our earliest childhood as a type of solidity, has oscillated like a thin crust beneath our feet, and seeing the labored works of man in a moment of overthrow, we feel the insignificance of his boasted power. I got the power from a rapper. False facts are intellectually injurious to the progress of science, for they often endure long, but false views, if supported by some evidence, do little harm. For everyone takes a solitary pleasure in proving their falseness. Ignorance more frequently begets confidence than does knowledge. I bisect it. I am fully convinced that species are not immutable, but that those belonging to what are called the same genera are lineal descendants of some other and generally extinct species, in the same manner as the acknowledged varieties of any one species are but descendants of that species. Furthermore, I am convinced that natural selection has been the most important but not the exclusive means of modification. Such simple instincts as bees making a beehive could be sufficient to overthrow my whole theory. It is necessary to look forward to a harvest, however distant that may be, when some fruit will be reaped, some good affected limit of man's knowledge in any subject possesses a high interest, which is perhaps increased by its close neighborhood to the realms of imagination. Sexual selection acts in a less rigorous manner than natural selection. The latter produces its effects by the life or death at all ages of the more or less successful individuals. I do not believe, as we shall presently see, that all our dogs have descended from any one wild species, but in the cast of some other domestic races. There is a presumptive or even strong evidence in favor of this view. A man has an instinctive tendency to speak as we see in the babble of our young children, but no child has an instinctive tendency to bake, brew, or write. Man can no longer be regarded as the lord of creation, a being apart from the rest of nature. He was merely the representative of one among many families of the order primates and the class Mammalia, a symphony beyond the confines of man. That is, humanity to the lower animals seems to be one of the latest moral acquisitions. Mammalia, about primates in the class of Mammalia, sympathy beyond the confines of man. That is, humanity to the lower animals. Acquisitions, it is apparently unfelt by savages except towards their pets. How little the old Romans knew of it is shewn by the abhorrent gladiatorial exhibitions. The very idea of humanity, as far as I could observe, was new to most of the gachos and the pampas. This virtue, one of the noblest with which man is endowed, seems to arise incidentally from our symphonies, sympathies becoming more tender and more widely diffused until they are extended to all sentient beings, as my books span about. If it wasn't for seasickness, all the world would be sailors. If I had to live my life again, I would have made a rule to read some poetry and listen to some music at least once every week. Ignorance more frequently begets confidence then does knowledge. I was a skill vocabulary, use my adequate documented education, my psychological competence was validating and elaborate, understanding completely adamant, randomly, consciously, accurately, and coherently. Minutia, the subject, antithesis, subjectarianism, califragialism, infinitism, rhymatism, extrasensorism, giantism, syllabalism, antithesis, subjectarianism, califragialism, infinite multiple syllabalism.